Dessert eaters, diners, BioContact friends, if I could get your attention, please. Mesdames et messieurs, thank you very much. Please keep eating, but you have to listen for a few minutes. We'll do it. I'll introduce our guest speaker, a great friend, an interesting speaker. My name is Marc Lepage. I'm the CEO of Génome Québec. In 2005, I left Génome Canada, where I was working at the time, and I went to San Francisco as the Consul General. And over the first few weeks, I'd meet people invariably at receptions, parties, dinners, things like this. And they would say, oh, you're Canadian, and you have to know, I'm against the war in Iraq, and I'm for the stem cell initiative. I'm against the war in Iraq, I'm for the stem cell initiative, and over time, I'm for the stem cell initiative. It was a defining characteristic of what it is to be a Californian. And it was a powerful statement. And our speaker today is the man who organized and drove the campaign for that initiative. In 2004, about 7.5 million Californians voted for a voter ballot initiative, the California version of a referendum. 7.5 million voted for, $6 billion investment in stem cell research, and our speaker was the man who drove the coalition, drove the campaign, and from 1986 until very recently was the first chairman. 2004? To 2004 till very recently. I'm stuck in the 80s. I liked it. It was a very nice decade. Thank you. 70s were good, too. 60s were great. Now, Bob has launched this thing, has got it underway. The initiative has been emulated in Texas, its own variation, in Massachusetts, and I hope someday here. That would be wonderful. You should know that Bob is a lawyer by training, a graduate of Stanford. He's a nice lawyer, just like every other lawyer in this room. There are only nice lawyers here, so you're good company. Bob has been in real estate, has been in finance, specializing in low-income housing and low-income housing policy. Has a great pedigree in that field. I think came to research partly through his work through the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, has been involved in JDFI International for many years, has a personal story on that front. He's a bit of a Renaissance man. He's also in the Global Security Institute, working for world peace. He was involved in the Canada-California Strategic Research Partnership. He was on the board of Genome Canada for a while. I was very happy and proud of that. And he has always been a friend of research, an advocate for patients, and a wonderful friend to Canada. We're very honored to have Bob with us today. And Bob, la plateforme est à vous. You're on. Thanks, Bob.
Bonjour. It's a pleasure to be here today. It is particularly a pleasure because I'm in the company of Martin Godbout, who, when he was chairman of Genome Canada, gave the California agency a great deal of guidance. Genome Canada had been in existence for a number of years, was at about 1.3 or 1.4 billion in commitments itself, as we started our $3 billion portfolio commitment. Cindy Bell of Genome Canada helped our agency in our application process, and Marc Lepage, when he was Consul General in California, was instrumental in building the joint Canada-California Task Force on Cancer Stem Cell Research that I personally co-chaired. It is important as I speak to you today to create a personal context so that you understand the perspective that I bring to this and the mission direction. Fundamentally, I'm a father with a son with type 1 juvenile diabetes, whose immune system turned against him at age 11, destroying the islets in his pancreas. It then went from a healthy young son to one looking to the future with the understanding, however rudimentary, of the potential for kidney loss and blindness, a life ending with amputations. As a father, that is very motivating. And in speaking here in Canada, there is special significance for me in the fight to advance medical research, particularly stem cell research, in dealing with type 1 diabetes and other chronic diseases and injuries. Because you have a tremendous history of discovery. Banting and Best are famous at the University of Toronto for discovering insulin. If you look to further west, you see the Edmonton Protocol, a protocol that proved that if you could transplant islet cells recovered from the pancreas of cadavers, those patients could become diabetes-free, but they would suffer under the massive immunosuppressants used to suppress the body so you would not get rejection. John Dick discovered cancer stem cells, which will soon, I believe, revolutionize cancer treatments. In Quebec, you have the historical marker of the 3TC AIDS therapy, revolutionizing treatment to an area where every patient was dying previous to that. And you have a history with infectious diseases, most recently marked by accelerated disease testing diagnostics. Quebec's leadership in genome sequencing, I think, is going to revolutionize the entire area of stem cell research, because based upon the evidence we're seeing, like in the area of breast cancer where the HER2 gene discovery led to Herceptin, we have now recognized that breast cancer has a number of subclasses and types that are genetically based. I think that's going to be true in diabetes. I think it's going to be true in heart disease, certainly across the other spectrum of cancer. And Genome Montreal, Genome Quebec has phenomenal genome sequencing capacity. Its leadership in the collaboration with California is going to be very important to the stem cell research we do there. And finally, Canada represents the first country that was an international partner with California in funding stem cell research therapies. There are 16 countries that have now partnered with California to fund cancer research therapies and clinical trials. Canada started with a $60 million match on 2 cancer stem cell grants, matching with California's $60 million. And the irony of that match is that one of the teams was led by Dr. Katrina Jameson at UC San Diego Cancer Center, who is in fact Canadian. So we were funding Canadians on both sides of the border. So I look at Canada in a strategic context in making my remarks, because when you look at North America and you look at the capacity for biomedical research and therapy development, California has the largest capacity, followed by Massachusetts, and then Ontario and Quebec before you get to the next state. So Canada is our logical strategic partner in North America, and Quebec is at the center of that Canadian-Californian opportunity. that strategic benefit of the relationship is really emphasizes a potential period of great gains in a revolutionary area of medicine where on a historical level it appears that we're going to be able to change the nature of human suffering. Before looking at the financing model in California to see how California has contributed to this and see if this model would in fact adapt to Canada, I think it is important to examine the potential of the stem cell research area and that revolution in the context of history. Because if we look back at the revolutions in medicine, they have not historically been without controversy. Certainly heart transplants and open heart surgery were originally considered to be anti-religious and lacked the respect for God. If we look back only to 1977, we can see an area of huge controversy and protests against recombinant DNA, one of the most recent revolutions in medicine. Those protests shut down Harvard's labs at Cambridge because this was an area where we weren't going to get any real therapies for humans. This was an area where the government was wasting its money. This was an area that was God's domain and man should not enter it. Similar protests to those against stem cell research today, particularly embryonic stem cell research. But that story is very, very important to me because that was 1977 and the government of the United States did not shut down its funding for recombinant DNA. In fact, it increased it. And 1 year later, in 1978, the City of Hope, a great research hospital in California, and UC San Francisco produced the first human product, the antecedent to artificial human insulin, which keeps my son alive every day. From that starting point, in the next decade, it led to 100 critical heart and cancer drugs that many of you may have participated in. It then led in the following decade to the knowledge to help us decode the human genome. So looking in that historical context of the controversy, we then asked ourselves objectively, what are the milestones of progress in stem cell research? Is this a maturing field that can accept biotech engagement and pharma engagement? Can it accept, at this point in its maturity and recognition of potential venture capital? So I draw your attention to several examples. First, age-related macular degeneration hits 1 out of every 5 people with partial blindness in North America. It is now in human trials in the United Kingdom, University College London, in association with Pfizer. Pfizer now leading those trials appear to be very promising. ACT in the United States, human trials in age-related macular degeneration and Stargardt's disease, another form of blindness. All 3 of those trials are retinal pigment epithelial cells derived from human embryonic stem cells. If you look at the literature from University College London on the preclinical trials, you'll see that the cells derived from human embryonic stem cells showed no inflammation when injected into the eye dealing with human cells, whereas the iPS cells, the artificial pluripotent cells derived from skin cells that are re-engineered to become pluripotent, did show inflammation. We're moving towards human trials with a company called ViaCyte in conjunction with UC San Francisco for type 1 diabetes. It should be something they file for within a year, they're hitting all their milestones. That trial is funded by the California Stem Cell Agency. We're about 18 months off of a human trial for stroke by Dr. Gary Steinberg at Stanford. He has a proof of concept patient where he used fetal derived neural stem cells. He can show you in a film before and after treatment where the patient regains substantial fine motor skills. He will, in the actual trial, be using neural stem cells derived from human embryonic stem cells, which he thinks will refine his approach. Human trials for AIDS. City of Hope and UCLA have competing teams that we have funded. Both have announced they expect to have an FDA approval within 12 months. That's stem cells combined with re-engineering to replicate a mutation in the CCR5 gene. There are 2 proof of concept patients that show that after cellular transplants from donors with this mutated CCR5 gene, the patient who was transplanted for lymphoma is free of lymphoma and free of AIDS. Glioblastoma in human trials, City of Hope. But in addition to cellular therapies, we're funding in California therapies that are coming out of the study of the biomechanics of disease and the origins of disease that can be addressed by small molecule therapies. Something that has been in the traditional area of target for pharma and venture capital. So we're in a phase 3 trial for polycythemia vera, otherwise fatal disease without a treatment. I do mean fatal. Stanford had 0 patients survive transplants trying to deal with this disease. Stanford's transplant history is otherwise above 80%. But Sanofi of Venice has bought the initial company. This is a JAK2 inhibitor that seems to be highly effective in actually curing this disease. We won't know how effective for years as we have to vet these through the phase 3 trials and wait for some period of time, but very strong positive indications. There's a sonic hedgehog inhibitor in a similar fashion that at UC San Diego discovered that they could control acute myeloid leukemia that was not responsive to other treatments, as well as myelofibrosis. Phase 2 trial funded originally in research by our agency. Cedars-Sinai Hospital in California is now under a phase 1 trial funded by the NIH for rebuilding the heart after an acute heart infarct. We are funding the phase 2 trial for that cellular therapy. So if, in fact, there are some milestones of progress that show great promise, how do we finance this revolution, whether in Canada or in California, because we certainly have a point in our history, given the financial crises and the history of low returns in the healthcare field in recent years, where we have to bridge the valley of death, the translational step, until we get through, at least from the stem cell perspective, phase 2 proof of concept trials. So that was my goal in writing the California Initiative. It was also a goal to protect the agency and the medical research funding and the therapy development from economic cycles and political cycles. So in writing the initiative, I wrote it into the state constitution that the public corporation created by the initiative could only be overturned by another initiative. Getting 7 million votes is indeed a barrier to instability. What we find here is we've created a public corporation where it is funded by issuing general obligation bonds to the state as the agency needs the money. The $6 billion approval is $3 billion for funding and $3 billion for the interest over 40 years for the bonds that will finance that funding. Realize when you're thinking, well, this was done at a better time, better financial history, this can never be replicated, that in 2004, it was a crisis year for California. In April of that year, we had to approve $15 billion of deficit funding bonds to pay state salaries. That's November of that year, they approved $6 billion for stem cell research. What we did with California is convinced the chambers of commerce, including the state chamber, and I mean all the chambers of commerce from San Diego to San Francisco, including the Orange County Business Council, which is not the home to revolutionaries, that in fact we needed to make a paradigm shift. A shift from looking at funding medical research as an operating cost that would compete with funding emergency rooms, to looking at investing in the intellectual capital, which was the infrastructure for the healthcare system, as a capital investment. I mean, after all, we call it intellectual property. Property is capital. It's a capital asset. And the public and all the chambers of commerce and 80 patient groups and 40 Nobel Prize winners signed on to the argument. We need a paradigm shift to look at the investment as an intellectual capital asset. Certainly we had the entire history of the 20th century to point to and say, look, in the 20th century, you used bonds to fund the physical infrastructure, the harbors, the roads, the bridges, and those states and cities that built their physical infrastructure prospered, and those that didn't and were inaccessible did not. And the intellectual capital we're now funding is in fact the critical capital of the 21st century if you're going to build a knowledge economy. So with that fundamental philosophical paradigm shift, California let us set up this public corporation. It had a board of 29. I chaired that board. That board is set up and populated by appointments by constitutional officers, but not political appointments. Appointments where I wrote in the criteria. You know, you have to make an appointment from a university with a medical school, with so many National Academy members, with a history of over $200 million a year of medical research for at least a decade. So, I mean, the appointments to this board are highly credentialed. All the members, all the deans of the UC medical schools are on the board, the dean of the Stanford Medical School, the dean of USC Medical School, president of the Salk Institute, the executive vice president of Scripps, president of the City of Hope, who was former FDA commissioner of the United States. These are credible, strong scientific leadership individuals. So this public corporation is stable. These terms of the board are 6 to 8 years. It's insulated from political interference. And I would suggest to you that the structure of the capital that's being provided is as important as providing capital. It's critical to provide capital because we're not going to get venture capital or biotech or pharma without partnership capital to reduce the risk in this new area. But the structure of the capital is as important. So this is a 12 to 15-year commitment of capital. About $250 million a year we're funding. Secondly, it has scale. It's critical to get the scale because otherwise the transaction cost eats you up. I limited the overhead to 6% of the total cost annually. And finally, the stability of that capital is very important because without the stability, we couldn't get 16 international governments to agree to fund their scientists with ours on our grants whenever it goes through our peer review. All of our peer review members come from outside of California. Some of them are from Canada. About 15 to 20% of peer reviews are normally international, from UK, Germany, Canada, Japan. So we have a stable source of capital that allows international collaborations. It also means that you can build the complicated teams you need to really accelerate medical discovery and translation into clinical trials. So when we do a $20 million grant for a clinical for what's called a disease team, you on that team have to come in and show that you've got the clinician on that team that's going to lead that trial, and that clinician is advising the basic scientist who's got the candidate for discovery and has got preclinical data. You've got a toxicology expert, you've got an FDA regulatory expert, you've got a developmental expert. You have to show that you've got the entire team, so we're not moving in small incremental steps, but through a smooth continuum with the full expertise to move through it. You cannot build a complicated team and get a clinician to stay on your team if 2 years from now he doesn't know if you have the funding. You have to have funding of scale where you can fund large teams, where there's stable funding. When you go through an economic cycle, as we are today, where California has pressure, our budget for paying the bonds is completely separate from the state of California. Our budget is assured through 7 million voters who said, you will fund the debt service on these bonds. In addition, this project is revenue positive through 2014, because seeing that there was a future with some financial problems for California and the United States, I set up the bond structure so it capitalizes the first 5 years of interest in the bonds. So there was no negative outflow in the first 5 years. It's very important to be very clear with the voters. There's not going to be revenue flowing or there's not going to be medical discoveries are going to reduce costs in the first 8 to 10 years, 14 years, maybe. What's critically important here to realize is that from a political viewpoint, from a cash flow viewpoint for the governments, it is something that even during times of financial crisis, they can launch a program like this, because in the first 5 years, when you don't have any cash outflow, you've got new income taxes from the jobs you're creating. Those revenues are coming in, building up, and they carry you through about year 8 or 9. Because of our stability of our funding, I will also point out that in just isolating one of our major competitions, which was for new facilities, I had set aside a maximum of 10% for new facilities, for research facilities and equipment. And in that competition, we put aside $270 million. Donor and donor institutions, realizing that we could carry forward all the way from a discovery candidate through clinical trials, came in with $900 million of donor money. I mean, it's a whole revolution. This is 2008 and 2009, they put up $900 million. Not particularly good years. It's really important to understand that we're going to have to bring a whole matrix together of funding sources, because we know that we're not going to get business capital in without leverage and without mitigating the early risk. We know that donor funds from the disease groups and public funds are critical to mitigate that risk. And as we move forward into the clinical trials, we do think that we're going to be able to continue what we've already shown, which is in clinical trials, companies come into those clinical trials, they're required to put up matching funds with us, because we want to know that they really believe in this clinical trial, they have skin in the game. But if they're putting matching funds, we cut their risk for entering a new area by 50%. Critical contribution. So when we look at applying this model to Canada, one of the things I ask is, why would a country in surplus, hopefully, want to fund with long-term bonds? Well, I will point out to you that from a political and an equitable argument point of view, it's really not the current taxpayer that should be paying for the healthcare infrastructure for the next 50 years. If you think back to the late 1950s, when the polio epidemic was so bad that in 2005 they were projecting it would cost $100 billion a year just to keep victims of polio in iron lungs in hotels built specifically for them, all of that cost was avoided by an investment in the intellectual infrastructure, in the capital infrastructure. So 50 years of benefit occurred from that capital investment in the intellectual infrastructure. In the same manner, if we revolutionize cancer treatment, stroke treatment, heart attacks, and how we approach them, that investment in intellectual capital should be spread over the next 40 to 50 years. Bonds spread the cost over the benefiting generations. It properly allocates the cost to those people who benefit. So I would suggest, both from an equity point of view and a political point of view, that in a place on a provincial basis like in Quebec, or on a national basis like the country of Canada, using long-term bonds to spread that cost does two very important things. One, you communicate to the taxpayer, you're going to have patience. This is a revolution, but it's going to take time to develop. And number two, it communicates to them that they're going to only pay their equitable share of that cost. I would also suggest that this is a time of tremendous opportunity for Canada, specifically. Some of you might remember that when Margaret Thatcher was in power and cut medical funding in UK, there's a number of scientists who left the UK and came to Canada. Some of your very distinguished scientists today in Canada were part of that exodus. Well, if you look at Europe and what is happening as they dismantle their research funding today, I mean, Spain, they're dismantling the medical research funding structure. If Canada can provide an increased level of funding now for an area of innovation like genomics and stem cell research, or the combination of genomics and stem cell research, you have the ability to attract some of the best and brightest from Europe. And what about the United States? Well, unfortunately, if you've been following the arguments about deficit reduction in the United States, and if you've looked at the vice presidential candidate of the Republican Party, who suggests that non-military funding must be cut in the United States, and cut substantially over a period of years, NIH funding in the United States has a prospect of a radical decline. Let me be specific. There is something called sequestration. It says we're going to take $500 billion out of military spending and $500 billion out of non-military spending, and this is the default solution if they don't raise taxes or otherwise come up with another solution. Well, in fact, even if the Republican ticket doesn't win, Paul Ryan will go back to being House Budget Chairman. And as House Budget Chairman, he's going to take a position. The military isn't cut and the non-military area is cut. But if, assuming that he relents on that position, which would be a little difficult to imagine, under the sequestration budget, the NIH gets cut about 11.1%. What does that really mean? Well, external or extramural grants to the NIH, if you look at the average amount of money provided to NIH institutes in any year, it's about 30% that are new funds. An 11% cut means they're going to cut a third of all extramural grants. That's assuming you cut the military. If you don't cut the military, we're talking about a very severe battle to sustain the capital investment in the United States to funding. So will that make a big difference? Well, today in Canada, about 17% of the grant application gets funded, as versus an average for all but the very senior applicants to the NIH of about 5% being funded. Today in the United States, it's an average of 42 years old before you get your first R01 or major grant. In Canada, it's 33 or 34 years old. You are in a strategic position to take and provide essentially a rescue to the very best researchers from the United States and Europe. When in your lifetime have you been in that position? This is a strategic opportunity to build on strength in North America, but you're going to need public funding, a substantial change in public funding, to exercise access to this opportunity. I would suggest to you that the California experience is going to give you some very good milestones, performance milestones, particularly in the next 18 months, as we have a large number of additional clinical trials starting. But we have 1,200 in the last 5.5 years since we got over some initial religious litigation that followed the vote. In the 5.5 years of funding, we have 1,200 peer-reviewed published articles on discoveries. It's now at about one every day. Very impressive productivity, but more importantly, you can see these moving into approvals that are peer-reviewed from people outside of California to creating 25 different disease teams. If you see 10 different human trials starting with cellular therapies, if you know there's human trials going on now, if you realize the Geron trial for paralysis only stopped because they were in a position where they had to make a choice between a cancer therapy that was very expensive but had a huge market and a paralysis therapy that had a very small market. I mean, if you look at all the milestones that are coming through, I think you'll be able to make a very strong case that this is a time when Canada has the opportunity to move into a maturing market and make a huge change. Finally, I would say that separate from the ability or opportunity to do it on a provincial level or a national level, there is an international precedent that potentially the United States and Canada can turn to. If we look back at 2006, that we see that, that Bill Gates and Gordon Brown then being the head of the government in the United Kingdom, came together and they did a variation of the bond program for California. They went to the World Bank for something called the IFFIM, the International Finance Facility for Immunizations. And they got 8 countries to commit to 20 years of payments and issued bonds through the World Bank that funded $5 billion went into tuberculosis treatments and research essentially for Africa. Well, I would suggest to you that at this time when national bond markets are not at their lowest interest rates, that the World Bank would be an appropriate place to address the world's immense challenges with chronic disease and injury. It is a common plight of mankind for millennia. If you look at the WHO and you look at their top disease targets, a number of the targets that are affecting both the developing world and the developed world. But we have a model that has been used out of charity. We could certainly use that model to finance the healthcare infrastructure to reduce the suffering of the people in North America, Europe, and the rest of the world, with 5 or 8 countries being all you really need to bring together to have some scale. The debt service constant on $1 billion right now through the World Bank is less than 5%. $50 million carries $1 billion. If you did a $100 billion program that was going to finance research over a 10-year period, $10 billion a year, You're talking about levels of commitment for these countries that is reachable and substantially more feasible than the huge annual appropriation traditional cycle of funding the research. We are not going to get $3 or $4 or $5 billion increases appropriated by the government of Canada or the United States. We need to look at a paradigm shift in how we finance the public involvement in potentially one of the most dynamic and broad-reaching revolutions in medicine over the last 100 years. In fact, I will tell you that Paul Berg, who got the Nobel Prize for recombinant DNA, evaluated the relative importance of this field for me in 2004. I was in a car with him and I had to raise $30 million for this campaign, and he'd taken me to see one of his major donors. And I said, Paul, you know, look, you got the Nobel Prize for recombinant DNA, and some people are telling me that stem cell research will have as great an impact on medicine as recombinant DNA. I said, I'm responsible to a huge number of people that are working on this campaign and contributing. I'm trained as a lawyer. You know, I have to really know what's your perspective. Is it possible stem cell research could be as important as recombinant DNA? And he looked at me and he didn't hesitate and he says, Bob, you just don't get it. He says, in the history of mankind, we have never in the history of mankind been able to make a single human cell. We now have the potential to make human cells and repair the heart or the kidneys or stop cancer. He said, this is an opportunity that will remake the future of medicine. In 20 years, you will have no idea that we ever practiced medicine as we do today. I was profoundly quiet for the rest of that ride. But I say to you, there is an opportunity of our lifetime. Look at the evidence, read the publications, look at the clinical trials, seize the opportunity. This is your day. Thank you.